introduction to skepticism for anybody who isn't familiar with the ideas and where it's come from. There's a lot of people, there's a lot of beliefs around. Right? We all know that the whole world is full of people with different beliefs, and some are good, some are not so good. And I think it's almost kind of on a spectrum, I suppose, from somebody just reading their horoscopes to ideas that are not so beneficial. Examples being the anti-vax movement, witch hunts, faith healing, particularly when it's done. When modern medicine is completely ignored, pyramid selling, Irish banks, any kind of idea that essentially takes off on its own without any proper evidence to support it. So the big thing really is, some ideas are good, some ideas are not so good, and the question is, how do you distinguish between the ones that make sense and the ones that don't make sense at all? How do you distinguish between ideas that are beneficial and ones that could lead you down to the situation where you're either losing an awful lot of money or your health is being compromised, or even worse? And that really is the core of what skepticism is about. As human beings, we're subject to confirmation bias. It's a technical term, but what it simply means is that we get ideas into our head, and then we spend time trying to prove those ideas correct. Any evidence that agrees with our ideas or our hypothesis, we're going to accept them straight off the bat. But any evidence that doesn't gel with our own preset ideas, we tend to ignore. And that tends to be the basis of an awful lot of pseudoscientific ideas. As well as that, there's an awful lot of bad arguments for an awful lot of things. I'm playing a little bit of spot the logical fallacy here. Fallacies of thinking, errors in logic that people make when they're trying to make arguments for why their particular idea, whether it be homeopathy or chiropractic, or whether it be a total aversion to vaccination, whatever it is, the same arguments keep on getting trotted out, or the same mistakes in logic keep on getting used. They use these arguments to convince themselves that they're completely correct and there could be no disconfirming evidence. And yet, when you actually drill down to it, the ideas are terribly poor. And one of the things is, as a skeptic, is to try and recognise that when people are using it and be able to point out the problems in the logic that people are using. And as well as that, of course, there's the placebo effect, which I'm sure Dr. Evans is going to talk about in a little bit more detail, where people are become convinced of the effectiveness of a particular remedy or a particular treatment, in some ways because it is working, because the power of suggestion is very, very strong. And there's been a lot of research done on the placebo effect, and when people say, well, I know chiropractic works, or I know being an osteopath works because look at all the happy customers. But a lot of it can come down to this effect. Often you hear as well people saying, oh yeah, once I was a real skeptic, but then once I got involved with this idea, I was completely converted over, and I completely believe now that it's correct. And it could be, again, it could have to do with alternative medicine, but it could have to do with religion, it could have to do with anything that sucks people in. They're given something that is sufficient for them to say, yes, this is perfect, I completely agree with this. But we forget that, as humans, we're very fallible, and that we're very, very easily deceived, that very often it comes down to how we actually perceive the world, and how we can easily be conned into believing something that isn't necessarily true. This, I think, is a good example of what's known as pareidolia, where you're looking at something that you can see the face in the picture of trees. Possibly deliberate by this artist, I'm not sure, but there's plenty of examples of pareidolia in real life, when you see the face of the man on the moon, or you see the face on Mars, or other things.
The Blessed Virgin's face in a tree.
Yeah, exactly, the Blessed Virgin in the tree. Whatever, you tend to see things that aren't exist. And again, our brains, it shows us that our brains are very often hotwired to see patterns, often where no patterns exist. Another optical illusion, again, just to kind of confirm, these are two exactly the same pictures, but for a lot of people, you tend to see one tower leaning over much stronger than the other tower is. But if you actually superimpose the two, they're exactly the same photograph. So how do we know whether something is correct or not? Is it just good enough to say, well, I saw it, and or I heard somebody say it was true? Is that good enough? And I don't think it is. The biggest tool in the armoury is science, right? Because science operates from very, very different premises than does the normal kind of pseudo-scientific effort. In a pseudo-scientific situation, you're trying to prove that something is true. So the whole idea, you get your idea, you want to get your evidence to prove that something is true. In science, the main premise behind the idea is to prove that something is not true. So it's only the theories that get accepted in science are the ones that you've pretty much hit them with everything you can possibly hit them with, and they're still standing because they conform to reality. And there's a lot of different techniques that are used in science, whether that be statistical analysis, or whether it be randomization, or whether it be a lot of different tests to take out the bias that is in here in the way we look at things. And I think that's something that's very often not totally understood about science, is that it's a very, very rigorous method to understand the reality and trying to separate what people's beliefs are from that. It tends to give you theories that you can pretty much go to the bank with. And the whole skeptical movement has really come from scientists because of the power of science to be able to distinguish, to be able to understand what reality, how reality actually works. And over there on the far left is Carl Sagan, who would be, certainly one of the real founders of the skeptical movement. His book, Demon Haunted World, if you haven't read it, it's certainly a tremendous read. And he pretty much lays out what skepticism is all about. But it's been aided by quite a number of other people, who have a very, very strong scientific background. Eugenie Scott, who has been involved in trying to explain science to the public, particularly over in the United States. Richard Dawkins, Brian Cox, P.Z. Myers, who's very prominent on the internet, and also Neil Tyson as well, the astronomer, who are absolutely brilliant people for explaining science to the general public, trying to make people understand that there's science on one side, but there's also pseudoscience on the other. Interestingly enough, it's not just science alone, it's also the magicians, right? Professional magicians. And the reason is that scientists can get fooled. The professionals in understanding when you're going to be fooled or not are magicians. And it's been the confluence of science and magic that really has created the skeptical movement as we know it today. Particularly James Randi, who's the arch nemesis of pseudoscience, but also the real figurehead of the skeptical movement around the world. He's spent decades fighting and challenging pseudoscientists and also psychics who want to pretend that parlour tricks used by normal magicians are actually something of another, from another world. And particularly in the last 10 years, Randy's ideas have started to spread around the world and become something that a lot of people have become very, very heavily involved with. He's also, the other people there are Jamie in Swiss, Banachek, and over in England, Richard Wiseman, who also have written quite a number of books and have also been very, very at the fore of the movement, trying to promote skepticism. So the idea really is to help this guy. Yeah, here we go. Become a little bit more important, right? So we're trying to basically promote reality as being something that's worthwhile. I was at the TAM London meeting a couple of weeks ago, and a Christian group had put up a big picture of somebody standing on top of a mountain range, looking out over this fantastic panorama, and the caption that they were using was, "Is this it?" And the answer was, well, fuck off, you solipsistic wanker. In other words, reality not good enough? As Douglas Adams once said, why are we trying to invent fairy tales when the garden itself is so beautiful. That's really what we're about in Skepticism, is promoting reality. It often comes out differently in terms of how other people perceive skepticism. Here comes the skeptic. We're not trying to rain on people's parade. We're not trying to identify every single possible instance of pseudoscience and silly and faulty thinking. But there's obviously a much more positive role to skepticism, which is, most skeptics are just very curious people. They want to understand, they want to know. And that's what motivates an awful lot of skeptics in the end. We want to understand what is actually going on. What are the processes behind the things that we're hearing about. We also want to understand why people think, such strange things in life. Why is it that people have these views or have these trenchant opinions, and what's going on inside their brains, and ignore what is actually going on in reality. So, it is in many ways, skepticism is a very positive process. It's all about trying to understand, asking questions, trying to get the evidence so that you can be convinced that what is going on really is true. And it's also about communicating. It's also about being able to get a dialogue going between ourselves and people we mightn't necessarily completely agree with. And also having the skills to be able to do that in an effective way. If you read around any of the local media, or any of the national media, you'll often see an awful lot of stuff that just beggars belief, and it's just taken 100% true, and there's not one single ounce of commentary about it, of discussion about it. It's just taken for granted. We want to start at least getting our viewpoint out there, which I think is a much, much stronger viewpoint. On the media are communicating within our, creating a network locally, where people might have certain amount of expertise to be able to go up against somebody who's peddling an awful lot of nonsense. We're also part of a much, much bigger group, which is the Skeptics in the Pub movements that are starting up in Ireland. There's one in Belfast, there's one in Dublin, there's also a large number of clubs in the UK, and there's a worldwide movement as well. So that's really it. I just took a quote from P.C. Myers, which says, we're here, we don't believe, and we've got science and reason on our side. Get used to it.